Díky, že jste přišli. Festivalová část programu se nám přehoupla do druhé poloviny. Já věřím, že bude neméně zajímavá a co víc, bude také vonavá, protože, jak jistě víte, budeme se věnovat vůním, nebo chcete parfémům a alchymii, která vlastně za vznikem parfémů stojí, nebo možná přesněji řečeno stála ve starověkém Egyptě a Řecku, o kterých tady dneska večer bude řeč. Alchymie vůní se také vlastně nazývá projekt, za kterým stojí mezinárodní tým odborníků. Je to mezioborový tým, protože jeho součástí jsou badatelé, kteří se věnují od filozofie, filologie, historie přes egyptologii až po chemii nebo botaniku. Takže to je na něm, myslím, jedinečné. No a já tady dnes mohu přivítat 2 ze členů tohoto týmu projektu Alchymie vůní. Prvním z nich je Coughlin, který tento tým vede. Je to filolog, filozof a vlastně se soustředí na starověkou vědu a medicínu ve svém bádání. A druhým, neméně významným členem týmu je Smrček, což je chemik, a ten se věnuje vlastně tomu procesu replikace starověkých vůní a snaží se přetlumočit do vlastně moderní chemické terminologie ty procesy, které stojí za přípravou starověkých parfémů. Oba kolegy, mohu asi prozradit, spojuje vášeň pro experimentální vědu, o čemž se dneska budete moci sami přesvědčit. A já už tady nebudu dlouho řečnit, jenom jedna poslední praktická poznámka. Asi jste pochopili, že dnešní přednáška se bude odehrávat v angličtině, takže jste si možná vyzvedli sluchátka. Za mě jenom pro jistotu taková malá instrukce. Sluchátka je potřeba zapojit do krabičky, která k ním patří. Po pravé straně tuším, že regulujete kanály, takže nastavte si ideálně kanál číslo 1, pokud chcete poslouchat češtinu. A po levé straně regulujete zvuk. Tak a teď už nám snad nestojí nic cestě, abychom mohli začít. A já dávám slovo Seanovi.
That's better. That's great. Yeah, thanks. So this is my first talk, interpreted. I'm going to speak a bit slowly, and if there are points where you don't understand or if there's some clarification needed, just pause me and we can go on. I want to start just by saying a bit about the project as a whole. So this project, Alchemies of Scent, is a truly interdisciplinary project. And this is actually quite rare. A lot of times you'll see projects that claim to be interdisciplinary, where the disciplines stay separate. In this, we are all working together all the time. So the project is funded by the Czech Science Foundation, by Gatcher. It's hosted at the Institute of Philosophy. But we've had incredible support and cooperation from the Institute for Organic Chemistry and Biochemistry. We have collaborators at the Institute for Experimental Botany, and we have collaborators actually from across the world, in Egypt, in Hawaii, in the United States and Canada. And all in different fields from, on the one side, we have Egyptologists and philologists and historians of science, and on the other side, we have chemists active in the field like Smrček and people in Ulrich Jan's lab at IOCB that are actually carrying out a lot of the experiments that we're working on. And this is just an incredibly amazing team of people to work with, and I'm just really grateful for all of them. Now, if I can go. So the project is a 5-year project, and you may know we're trying to recreate perfumes from Greco-Egyptian period. And we're doing 5 perfumes, 1 a year. It's not that many, but it's actually incredibly difficult to try to understand the processes that they were doing and to try to sort out the different types of plants and spices and and tools and instruments that they were using based on written texts and archaeological evidence. One of my favorites is the year 4. I'm not going to get into this in detail, but if people have questions, we can go over them. But one of my favorites is year 4, which is a perfume called the Susinum. It's a lily perfume. And we need to find someone in Prague to help us grow 3,000 lilies, because we will do this one to scale. And then we'll need volunteers to help us pick the lilies over 3 days, 1,000 a day, in order to produce this oil, and just see what happens when you put this many flowers into the oil. So this will be quite a fun treat in 2024. So that's enough of the introduction. Let me get back here. So let me start the talk, and I want to start the talk with a question. And the question is, what if we could reproduce the past? And maybe we can specify a little bit more. What if we can reconstruct the world of past sense? Now, I'm asking this question for kind of self-interested reasons, because this is something that I tried to do. I'm going to keep looking back at these slides. Maybe I'll take the mic, actually. Is it okay if I take the mic? Yeah. Is this, yeah, maybe this is a bit better, because I'm going to keep, otherwise it'll just keep cutting out. So in 2012, 2 archaeologists named Robert Lippmann and Jay Silverstein were working on a site with some students at a place called Tel Tamai in Egypt. Now, what they came across was quite strange. They came across a hoard of buried gold and silver coins, and they found a lot of small broken lakuthoi, a Greek word meaning a perfume bottle. And they found in this is actually a picture of the Tel, which is just a big hill. They found what seemed to be a processing site for liquids. We can even get a little bit of a close-up of the site. So here is we see these are amphora, and they're running in pairs down a long line here. So amphora are big containers for storing liquids. Here we see these 2 vents. These are flues that would have been letting air in. It seems like they were letting air into a furnace, which is this base unit here. So this liquid processing site was really interesting to them, because this area had long been hypothesized to have had a perfume factory in it, and I'll explain why. So the place, Tamai, the name actually comes from a place called Thmuis in ancient Egypt, in Ptolemaic Egypt. Actually, the first time we see it pop up in the record is in the 5th century. Herodotus describes it in his histories. And Thmuis is kind of a sister city of another town called Mendes. And Mendes was quite famous in antiquity as being the capital of the 16th nome of Egypt. It was a site of quite political importance, site of some rebellions against different occupiers. And during the Ptolemaic period, after Alexander defeated the Egyptians and conquered the territory, Mendes started to decrease in its importance, and Thmuis became much more prominent. Now, this whole complex, called the Mendes-Thmuis complex, is interesting from the history of perfumery for one reason, and that is that there was a famous set of perfumes that came from this area around the same time of Alexander, and these are the Mendesian and the Metopion. And these were famous throughout the ancient world for their luxuriousness, for their incredible expense. They kind of took the ancient world by storm for a few hundred years. And so when they discovered this liquid processing site in the city of Thmuis, which is part of this Mendes-Thmuis complex, it seemed quite reasonable to think, oh, maybe this is a perfume factory. And National Geographic wanted somebody to make the perfume, because when they had an exhibition in Washington, D.C., they wanted an example of it there for them. And so I was asked by Robert and Jay, along with a PhD student at the Freie University in Berlin named Dora Goldsmith, an Egyptologist who works on scent in ancient Egypt, to help reconstruct it. Now, I'm a philosopher by training. I'm actually I study ancient philosophy. I study Aristotle and Aristotelian science. But I have a major interest in the history of cosmetics and pharmacology, which is how I came into this project. And actually, in the last decade, not just our project, this is the paper that came out of that study that was published last fall. But in the last decade, there's been more and more interest in the history of scent, both in the humanities and in the sciences. And also in ways of probing the past to bring it back by using analytical chemical techniques. So there was a paper in Nature Human Behavior that came out recently by a colleague at the Max Planck in Leipzig. And in that paper, it's claimed that we can start to reconstruct the past by beginning with the residues that are found in the bottom of perfume jars from antiquity. Not just that, but that among other things. And actually, if you look at the news, if you ever look up Cleopatra's perfume, you'll see the results of our study being talked about, and they always say the same thing, which is that we started from the residues found in the bottom of a perfume bottle. That's false. We didn't, because first some permit problems, and then COVID got in the way of us actually getting the permits to do any of those studies. So we actually have no idea what's in those residues yet. We're still waiting for the results. We took a different track, but that still leaves it the case that people talk about it like this. And you can see why people would be interested in scent, right? Scent is quite interesting for a lot of reasons. We don't have a developed vocabulary for scent in the way we do for other senses, like sight, even like taste. But it's quite an important sense in that it ties very deeply to human memory, to human emotion, in ways that the other senses don't quite do. So it's also important biologically. I mean, scent tells us when to stay away from something, when something is going to be quite toxic and poisonous to us, in a way that the sight can't tell us, and in a way that even touch can't tell us or taste. But it's not just important for human life, it's also important for trade. Huge spice roads existed in antiquity that crossed both land and sea, bringing in goods from all over the world to the wealthy patrons in Rome and in Greece and even in Egypt. And it's also been quite important in art and medicine and in culture. So in Egypt, I mean, scent was something that was supposed to be divine and a symbol of the divine, and it's how it's always represented. In Greece, scent is always associated with aesthetic or cosmetic beauty, and we also find that perfumery itself is really tied in with medicine, so that most of the perfumes that were used were also medicinal. They had different aromatics in them, which were supposed to ward off different diseases in ways that we'll talk about in a little bit. But so you can see, based on all of these things, why it would be amazing if we could reconstruct a world of past sense, because maybe that would give us access to this world that's lost in a way that we don't have access to simply through texts, simply through the things that we read. There's one problem though, and that's, at least if we're starting from residues, that we can't. We actually can't reconstruct a world of past sense by studying the residues. Or so I want to show in this. But what we can do is we can bring together chemists and Egyptologists and historians of science, not to study the scents themselves, but to study the ways they were produced, and maybe then indirectly try to approximate what it would have been like to have sent something in the past. So that's what I want to talk about today. But before we start, I want to do a little bit of a warm-up. So this is a bit of an exercise. So maybe if Jana and Jakob could go down and they can start the first exercise. So throughout the talk, we're going to be having scent exercises. It would be boring enough just to sit here and listen to me ramble on, but this way we can get a little bit about what I'm trying to talk about when I'm talking about scent, this thing for which we don't have a lot of words. So while they're preparing this, I'll just say a bit about what we're going to do. We have waters that we will pass out. We don't have enough for everybody, so we're going to pass them out kind of randomly, and people will have the opportunity to smell something, and then we will ask in a very interesting way, because we're working across languages, how people feel about the smell, what they think about when they smell it, and then we'll ask if you know what it is. And this should get a bit harder as we go on, that's the idea. First one should be quite easy, and then we're going to get quite difficult. And if you smelled it for a little bit, you can pass it along to your neighbor and just share around. So when you're smelling this, you maybe will smell some floral notes, maybe something fresh. Maybe something a little bit spicy. You might have some memories of clothing drawers trying to keep away moths. Does anyone have an idea of what this is? You could just shout it out if you have an idea, but maybe a little bit loud because it's hard for me to hear with the echo. Yeah, perfect. So this is lavender, lavandula. Actually, what's fun about the word lavender is it tells you exactly what it is. If you go back to what the word means, it comes from the Greek word luē, or the Latin word lavare, which just means to wash. Because this was typically associated with washing clothes. This was something that you did with it. And the name preserves that. So it doesn't even have a name before the association with cleaning. So that was an easy one. Okay, that was a giveaway. So let's try the next one. If I can skip to the slide. Okay. This next one, I'm not gonna prejudge it, so I'm just gonna let it be handed out. Okay. So what do you think of when you smell that? Not the actual flavor, but what kind of associations come to mind? Spazza. Huh? Spa, like a spa. Ah, I see. Yeah. Okay. I mean, typically what we might think of when we smell this is something maybe a bit citrusy, but not as sweet as a lemon or a lime. It's a bit bitter. It's a bit spicy. I think there are two things that came to my mind when I was smelling this usually. One of them is usually Coca-Cola. Although Coca-Cola actually uses a different thing. Or Earl Grey tea is the most famous thing with this in it. This is bergamot. It's a type of orange. This is the essential oil of bergamot. Now, bergamot's interesting. It's this kind of wordy orange. And this type of plant, actually, you can use lots of different parts for different things. So neroli is an oil that comes from another bitter orange. And that's used as the flavoring in Coca-Cola. And bergamot itself, as I said, was used in Earl Grey tea. The sticks and twigs produce another oil that's used in different contexts. It's quite a productive plant. So bergamot, that was good. A lot of you got that one. Let's try one more for the warm up. Can you smell it? Okay, so here's the last one for the warm up, and let's see what people get with this one. You're just looking at the picture, you didn't even get the smell. But I'll just say this is not cadillo. It's not frankincense. This one. But I'm more interested in what does it smell like to you when you smell it? One of the things that's really fun is, so I come from Canada, and in Canada we don't do a lot of picking of mushrooms. But since I've been here and we've been testing this a lot in the lab, Jacob always tells me that this smells like champignon. And I say, this does not smell like a champignon to me. And he says, that's because you've never been out picking mushrooms in the forest. If you've done this, then you would know that this is what it smells like. So I'm going to leave this one. We're not going to answer this one just yet. We're going to come back to this one. But you might think when you're smelling it, things like warm or balsamic. You might think sweet, you might think spicy. But we'll leave this for now. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to say, I said a little minute ago that we can't actually reconstruct the history of past tense, which is funny that I'm giving a talk on this. And I want to explain then a little bit about what I mean, about why I don't think it's possible. And I think there are like three major problems for the typical story that people give about reconstructing past tense that you read in the newspaper. And these, before I go into those, let me just tell you what the typical story is. You've probably read it in the paper before. The typical story is that they're the archaeologist, dusty, out in the field, digging holes, finding things. They don't know what they are. They don't know what's in them. So then they send them to the scientists,
And the scientists have an incredible, expensive apparatus, lots of lights, it makes noises sometimes, and then the scientists can hit a button, and then it prints out a receipt, and it tells you exactly what is in that compound, and then from there they go and they make something out of it, or they put it in a museum, or something like this. This is actually, that middle step, that science step, is incredibly laborious. It takes huge amounts of time, and usually for reasons we'll see, the results aren't always quite obvious. But that's the typical story. Here are three kind of in-principle problems with this story. And the first one, I'm calling these challenges to the typical story, is this. The materials that are around today are not the same as the materials that are around in the past. Call this the world isn't what it used to be problem. I'll give you one example. In northern Libya, a place called Cyrene, here, there was a town that grew something famous in the ancient world, a spice that was called silphium. It was used in every dish. But for some reason, here, I'll show you a picture actually. We don't have a picture of it, obviously, because it's extinct. But we do have it on a coin. This is what it kind of looked like, and this is a coin from Cyrene. It was so important to their economy that they minted it on their coins. But around the year 60, the last stock of this plant was given to the Emperor Nero, and after that, it disappears from the botanical record. We think, based on that image from the coin, that it might have been a species of ferula, something like fennel, something like asafoetida, but we're not quite sure. The point is, we know this went extinct because it was recorded. We have no idea how many other species went extinct or changed over time that weren't recorded. And so it's a huge step for us to assume that the things that we find from the past are going to have contemporary exemplars existing without having undergone change. This is very obvious for cultivated plants, but it also happens with wild ones as well. So that's the first problem. Let's call that the world isn't what it used to be problem. Second problem, even if the materials were the same, we still wouldn't know what's in an ancient perfume if we were to find the residues. And the first reason, right, is quite obvious, and that's because these are residues of perfumes or scented compounds. Scented compounds come into the nose because they're volatile. If they sit around for a few days, these paper sticks that I've handed out won't smell like anything. So you can imagine that these volatiles sitting around for thousands of years are not going to have any of the compounds in them that gave them their characteristics, so it's going to be very hard. But you might say, okay, but what happens if something's kind of covered and preserved perfectly? Well, even if one of these things was preserved perfectly, if I can get to the next slide. There we go. Even if, this was a study done in 2011 by some scientists at the University of the University of Pisa. And it was Maria Colombini and her lab. And what they did was they reproduced a 17th century ointment from a recipe in a book, gave it to 11 labs, and asked them, use whatever analytical technique you would like, tell me what is in this ointment. Of the 11 labs, a few got close to a few ingredients. Not a single one was able to identify all the ingredients. So this is with something that was prepared today using standard techniques. They couldn't tell. So our chances for being able to tell something from the past is very, very small. Okay, this is pessimistic. We're going to get even more pessimistic now. And that is, even if we could know what was in them, we still couldn't understand it. And this is another test. So if you could get the Mendesian ready. So now we're going to do a little smell. So this is the last sample I actually have of the Mendesian perfume that we made for National Geographic in 2019. So you guys are going to be some of the few people to have smelled this outside of Washington, D.C. And obviously, I'm being very pessimistic, so I'm not sure if this is really what it would have smelled like, but this is the best guess that we have. And I'd like you to tell me what you think of this smell, what you associate it with, and then we can see whether we actually understand what it would be like to have worn this in the past. I'm going to just pick it up so I can show them a little bit. It's Oh, this is oily, so watch your clothes. So this is just to say, you can also see what an old perfume would have looked like. They're using oils instead of alcohol, since we'll talk about that. But they have a quite fine consistency, and you can come after the talk if you want to come up and take a look at it and put some on your skin and see what it would feel like. Now, if you are still overwhelmed by the lavender and the bergamot, you can always refresh your nose by just smelling the kind of crook of your arm. It smells very familiar, so it'll kind of bring the nose back to a baseline in its way, and you can smell again. Now, I've heard a lot of people, when they smell this, if you're able to smell something off of it, this I made in 2019, so it's amazing it still has any scent at all. But you will notice maybe that this smells a bit like, I've heard strudel, maybe a bit like Christmas cooking. And that's because, I mean, one of the main ingredients is cinnamon, right? So it's one of the most, but you can imagine this is the recipe for this perfume is really just, it's mostly cinnamon and mostly a resin that we're going to talk about soon. That's what was in it. So regardless of how we made it, if we know what the cinnamon was, and we tried lots of different species of cinnamomum varieties, and if we know the kind of resin it was, then this should be something like what it would have smelled like. It would have smelled like a Christmas strudel that you're putting on your pot. So, now you might wonder then how this kind of a scent was tied with, how did Cleopatra seduce Mark Antony with a strudel, right? Like this is the question. How did she win over Julius Caesar? By wearing this preparation. It's just so hard for us, and that's because scent, I mean, given that the series here is about the public and the private, I mean, scent, due to the fact that we don't have the vocabulary for it, and due to the fact that it's really just tied emotionally to us as a result, something deeply private, right? This is something that only becomes public when it's associated with specific things. And because we're missing those associations from the past, we're going to have different ones that are going to mean something completely different. You might extend this to lots of other different sensory modes. You might say, well, we don't understand the visual art from the past. I think this is a deep philosophical problem, but unlucky that we're not going to really get into here. It's just a problem for trying to reconstruct the past. So I want to say then, what can we do? If we can't start from residues, what's left for the study? Well, what we can do is we can start, at least I think, and what the project is doing, is start from the recipes, because these we have preserved. Now, recipes are really interesting texts. They're really interesting genre. You probably have lots of them at home. You've probably seen them during the pandemic quite a bit, when everyone was curious about cooking new things because they didn't have anything else to do. Recipes are like scientific papers in a way, right? They're things that record somebody's interaction with the material world and give you instructions to be able to do that thing again. And the other thing that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about this chemical world, or this physical world that people are interacting with, is that it hasn't changed between now and the past. So if we have somebody's record of their interaction, and if we assume that the chemical rules that pretty much everything in the world obeys haven't changed, we should be able, if we have the right ingredients, if we have the right starting materials, be able to end up with the same result. Now that's the theory, right? Like that's the idea. Of course, it's very difficult. Everyone knows you start with something when you perhaps make a cake for the first time and it works really well. And you want to write down what you did. So you write it down on the recipe. And then somebody else takes the recipe and they try to replicate it, right? They try to do the same thing that you did. And very often the way they know they did the same thing is they went back and they could check with you. They could ask you, is this the same thing? Does this taste the same? Is this good? And you'll say yes. And when we're talking about the recipes from the past, we don't have that. We don't have that starting point, right? So we just have the recipe. And so that means that our target isn't clear. And this is a major problem for the project, right? So I'm not going to say anything about it now. I'll come back to it. For now, I just want to say that the premise of this project, Alchemies of Scent, that we're working on is to try to replicate, not the scents themselves, right? But it's just to replicate the chemical reality that led people to write things down the way that they